Hello, everybody. If you have ever wondered what an ADU is, I know what they are, but don't know anything about them. Today, we're going to learn all about ADUs from a specialist in that field, Whitney Hill. So Whitney, really glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Jonathan. Excited to be here.
So can you give us the 30-second snapshot of where you are right now? And we'll dig into the backstory later, but tell me what it is that you do, who you are and what you do in your elevator pitch.
Well, I'm the co-owner and head of business development at Snap ADU, a general contractor that builds accessory dwelling units in San Diego. We design, permit, and build ADUs, granny flats, in-law suites. All of these are smaller structures on residential properties, and the state of California has made it a lot easier for us to build those in the last several years with some legislation intended to make more housing available.
So is there any difference between an ADU and a granny flat and a mother-in-law suite, or is it just the same term for all those? I mean, these are interchangeable terms for the same thing.
They largely are. So back in the past, a city might have had something for a guest house that was different than an accessory dwelling unit. Maybe one didn't have a kitchen, that sort of thing. But nowadays it's all used interchangeably, and it's kind of a regional thing. In Canada, where ADUs are very popular, they're called laneway homes. So it really just is a regional thing.
So, yeah, I mean, I've noticed, it's funny, I was walking around here in Brooklyn yesterday and I walked down a street that I usually don't walk to. And I noticed that there was, I guess, what we used to call a mews house, or I think in England, they call them mews houses too, like a house behind a house. There's a few of them in New York, but they're not that common. But so can you talk a little bit about, ADUs? And I know that, like, as you mentioned, California has just recently kind of leaned into them as a way to try to increase the supply of housing. You want to give us a little bit of background about that, maybe sort of the history of ADUs and where this new legislation came from?
Happy to. So you could build an ADU in California for decades now. I think in the 80s were the first bills passed at like a local level, and some that were less sweeping at a state level. But the important ones that were passed started in late 2019 that removed all of the minimum lot sizes, also reduced setbacks so that you only have to have 4 feet on the rear and side yards, and allowed up to a 1,200 square foot unit. And so that just really allowed a lot more to be built that couldn't have otherwise. Things like parking requirements were also reduced. Fee structures were reduced so that now instead of paying $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to permit this ADU, you're paying closer to $5,000 or $10,000. So all of these barriers were removed by state mandate, which meant that all these local governments were trying to keep up. And that's one of the interesting things about being in this space, is that you're at the intersection of state and local regulation and interpretation. So even though the state rule might say something, the local government has not always caught up in the same way, and we'll see different interpretations in different jurisdictions. We just operate in San Diego County, but that covers 18 different jurisdictions, and we have to know all the nuances of each one of those, when to push back and when we need to advocate for our homeowners who might otherwise be charged more money than they should be for things like having right-of-way work when they don't need it. So improvements to the street that are not legal per the state rule about ADUs, that sort of thing.
Yeah, without delving too much into like the legal esoterics of this, yeah, does the state law control? Like, can you always like fall back on the state law, or are the municipalities able to make it more restrictive than the state?
The state sets a floor, more or less, of what must be allowed. And some cities have actually decided to go above and beyond that. City of San Diego itself has allowed for many more ADUs in certain situations of transit areas that are high priority for housing, that sort of thing. Some cities have allowed for ADUs to be bigger than 1,200 square feet. So the cities can allow more. There's a floor, though, that they have to allow per the state rules.
And what is the minimum requirement for an ADU? Does it have to have a kitchen? Does it have to have, like, what are the things that it's got to have for it to be compliant?
Exactly, a kitchen, independent, it's called a, independent facility for cooking is how it's described. It needs to have sanitation facility, which is a bathroom. And you can build these anywhere between 150 square feet, just a tiny studio, all the way up to 1,200 square feet, like I mentioned, which can fit 3 or 4 bedrooms. So that's really it. And as far as what kind of lot they can be built on, they can be built on residential lots, but both single and multifamily lots. In multifamily scenarios, you're also allowed to convert existing space that's not habitable. So we see some folks converting existing garage bays into several additional studio units, or maybe converting an old exercise area that was never used, or a laundry room. So those are other options on multifamily properties.
And so something you alluded to there, I mean, can you make multiple dwelling ADUs? Like if you have enough space, can you put 2 units or 3 units back there, or are you limited to 1?
On single family dwellings, you're allowed 1 accessory dwelling unit and 1 junior accessory dwelling unit. A junior has to be carved from existing space, like a garage. On multifamily lots, you're allowed 2 regular ADUs. They could be stacked, they could be attached to each other, plus unlimited number of conversions on existing space, so long that it's not more than 25% of the existing units. And then, like I said, some cities like San Diego have allowed more units on top of that, so long as you conform to underlying floor area restrictions, height restrictions, and everything else that goes along with the zone. And the intent there is to add some density in areas that would have otherwise allowed it. Perhaps it's old parcel of land that was kind of underdeveloped in the first place.
And what kind of impact is this having on the supply of housing in that market? Is it too early to tell, or is it a measurable impact it's making?
I would call it a modest impact. As far as how many are happening, though, about 20% of the building permits issued in the state of California last year were for ADUs. So it's a significant chunk of the building activity going on. Statewide, it's something like 55,000 units that were added last year. So it's not going to independently move the needle, but it's part of an arsenal of tools that the state is deploying to try to increase the housing stock. And what we like about it is that they are so flexible and targeted at families that want to increase options for older relatives, younger relatives who can't afford the market, or maybe they want to have the opportunity to bring in some rental income and stay where they're at. So we like that they're so flexible and truly targeted at average homeowners.
So you are able to rent these out to unrelated people. They don't have to be family members or anything like that.
Correct. They must be rented for periods of 31 days or more. So the intent there, not to have little Airbnb villages, but these to actually address the housing stock issue.
And is there any kind of like NIMBYism or anything that is, comes up when people want to build ADUs, or are people mostly accepting of these coming into their neighborhoods?
You do still see NIMBYism, of course, but I would say overall we've seen acceptance of this grow in the 3.5 years we've been specializing just in ADUs. So, recent polls that you'll see, something like 75% of the population here is supportive of ADUs, which is pretty strong. And honestly, for the work that we're doing, we're we're always trying to blend in with the existing landscape of a neighborhood. It's required by law in most cases. And if there's an HOA, you do have to adhere to those standards. They just can't reasonably prohibit you from adding the ADU so long as it conforms to the rest of the aesthetic of the neighborhood, that sort of thing.
So that's interesting. So you can't have HOAs or restrictive zoning or anything like that prohibit you from building an ADU if you want to build one. It empowers the property owner to build what they want. Is that right? I mean, not what they want, but I mean, as long as they conform to the law. But these other kind of restrictive covenants or whatnot can't interfere with a homeowner deciding to build an ADU if they want.
Exactly right. They can't flat out prohibit it. There's going to be interpretation over what is reasonable restrictions on the design of it. But it's really just a question of money and time on that sort of a thing. They're going to be able to add an ADU if it fits.
I mean, that's interesting because you would think that there would be a lot of opposition, particularly say like in wealthier neighborhoods where people have large lot zoning and things like that, where the reason people buy in that kind of area is because it's large lot zoning and low density. I mean, what have you seen happening in those places or those areas where people are wealthy enough that they don't want to build an ADU anyway?
Yeah, we actually see quite a bit of activity in that subset because we do specialize in larger, more custom units, two-story structures that have a garage as well, so end up being a sizable project. So we have several in the in areas that do have HOAs or have the larger lots that you're talking about. So we see acceptance kind of across demographics here. You'll see them in the neighborhoods that have $5 million houses. So they're embracing the intergenerational living as much as anyone else. So you do see them more for family use in those areas versus rentals, but they might rent it out when they're not there, something like that. So we do see it happening. As far as pushback, you'd be surprised in some ways how little pushback there is. Well, when you see it, it's more about those bonuses I was mentioning in the city of San Diego, where you might be able to add 8 extra units in the back of a single family home. Someone's upset about, now I have this 8-unit thing right over my property line. Those are the situations you hear it more, and that's not really where we specialize. So I think as a company, we've been fortunate not to face much pushback on the type that we're doing.
So let me ask you this. So I'd like to turn a little more to kind of what you're doing as opposed to the general background of ADUs. But, you know, there's a lot of, in real estate, you could do many, many different things, right? There's all sorts of stuff you could choose to do. So of all the things that you could have chosen to do, why ADUs? What was it about that business in particular that kind of lit a fire under you?
ADUs were an exciting space once the regulations were relaxed and that angle was no longer the bottleneck. It was evident that it was going to be general contracting capacity that was in demand there, to try to meet that new market that had been developed for ADUs almost overnight. So at the time when I learned about ADUs back in late 2019, early 2020, I was doing high-end flips on the East Coast, actually. I had lived on the East Coast for decades and was, doing that remotely from San Diego. We'd moved as a family out here. So I was looking for a way to pivot that new understanding of general contracting that I had inadvertently picked up from doing these flips as the financing partner who got much more in the weeds when I realized that our processes needed work. So I was looking for opportunities to do something locally, and the intersection of what I was learning in general contracting just meshed up so nicely here with the ADUs. That was a lot of infill development, had some analogs to what we were doing with doubling the square footage on the East Coast, taking a little Cape Cod and adding a second story and renovating the whole thing. So there was enough overlap there that I knew what to look for. And so I was able to meet a partner out here who had been in construction his whole life. And so our skill sets were quite complementary. He already had a small contracting business that was trying to get into ADUs. So we partnered up and were able to much more quickly come into a scale of ADUs that would allow us to get the experience in the market to start leading. So my background was in operations management and strategy consulting. I did that for about a decade before leaving to do things in real estate. And when I say things in real estate, it was a bit of a shotgun approach in the beginning. I invested in syndications, bought a 6-plex in Columbus, Ohio, started doing these flips. So it really was all over the place. And when I finally found this niche of ADUs and saw that we had something here that could take off, it was a relief to be able to focus on something and get back in my lane of what I'm good at, which is process improvement, people management, that sort of thing.
So tell me a little bit about this sort of fix and flip business that you had developed. How long were you doing that? How did you get into it? And what was the nature of it?
Yeah, I was approached by a local contractor back in Bergen County, New Jersey, and he was looking for a financing partner. At that time, I had financed a few other small flips, but was more hands off. So we partnered up on 7 of them from the period of 2018 to late 2019. We were still holding 3 of them when COVID hit in the beginning of 2020. So that was an interesting time to be holding flips with high interest rates. So during that process, we were trying to come up with repeatable models so that we could, continue to do this, have our acquisition strategy look the same for the type of neighborhood we were going for, type of property, type of defects, if that was the case. We were trying to find ones that had things that we were good at fixing. And so, that was something, though, that is not always repeatable. You're working with existing structures. There's just so many more unknowns in that kind of a scenario. So I think that experience for sure led to some of the specialization that we do at Snap ADU, where we only handle detached new construction. We don't do the renovations, like I was talking about, the converting space, those sort of things, because it's not as repeatable. And it has all these other ramifications on your selling process. You have to go on site. You have to assess what's there. You have to make some guesses about about what's behind the walls. And we have to do that with the site, but that's a much more defined space for us to operate in. So it's allowed us to have processes in place that we can continue to use throughout the county.
So what is the process by which these come about? I mean, so if you're obviously as a fix and flipper, you're looking for properties to acquire, you fix them up and you resell them. Now this is a bit more of a service business, I guess. I'm assuming you're not going and buying properties where you can put an ADU and building an ADU and selling them. You're doing this on behalf of the homeowner. So how does that process work exactly?
On the flipping side or the process with ADUs?
No, on the ADU side.
Mm-hmm. So it's like you said, it's a service business. We try to frame it in some ways as a product. So we do have about 40 different floor plans on our website that homeowners can start from, and from there, make tweaks for their property and that sort of thing. But you're right, we don't own any property. We don't look to do any of that at this time. It's purely construction for others. So we have to scope the entire project upfront to make sure that the funding is going to be there. And in the last year, more and more of our jobs have just been in cash or self-finance jobs because the financing doesn't pencil out for the rentals. But again, lucky for us, we're more focused on the higher end custom type work that did have a lot more cash buyers to begin with. So once we have that scope all figured out during our sales process, that's when we will actually start going to the site to confirm everything that we assumed during that process. So we'll go map out the utilities to make sure we don't have a sewer line running through the path of the ADU. We'll go assess if the electrical panel can take the additional load from the ADU, all these things that need to be vetted to have no surprises down the road when you're actually building. So once we do those site visits, we'll firm up all of the numbers on the scope of work, issue a final build cost for the homeowner to make sure that all of that will work with their budget before they proceed to full set of construction drawings to get this permitted to be built on their property. So we handle design, permit, and build all under one roof, all with our own employees. And that whole process can take anywhere from 10 or 11 months up to 18 months, depending on the city. So some cities were just massively overloaded with applications for ADUs, also just employee shortages like everyone has faced in the last couple of years. So we saw some sitting there for 6-8 months. So that would be a lion's share of that timeline I gave you. And then the build out itself takes between 5 and 6 months for these structures.
I actually did want to ask you about how these are financed, about whether people can get normal financing for them. In a normal scenario, are people able to finance these, and if so, how?
Yes. In a normal scenario, we see a lot of HELOCs, a lot of refis. That was popular the first 2 years we were doing this. You can also get a construction loan for it. And there's certain hybrid products that allow you to borrow on the after repair value, but it's not really a full-fledged construction loan. There's less red tape. So several products of that nature. We see lots of fixed rate second position mortgages now as well, because no one wants to touch their 3 or 4% primary, which makes sense. So those are various methods we see like from the family side. For investors, we'll see folks using portfolio loans against the rest of their assets in their portfolio, that sort of thing. But like I mentioned, at the current rates, it's very difficult to get these to really pencil out. And we're in coastal San Diego, some of the most expensive real estate out here. And even so, we're seeing a huge slowdown in that arena.
And that's just because the build cost versus the rents just is not penciling out. Is that kind of just to be specific about it?
Right. And the ongoing interest rate is just, it's overwhelming the rent that you're going to get. And these are renting for a lot of money. So we just built one that was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,000 square foot unit. It's listed at $6,200 a month. So, these are considerable rents in some of the more coastal areas we build in. But when you're looking at 9-10% interest, that's a high hurdle.
And what does it cost you to build them?
So the bigger you go, the cheaper per square foot, of course, because you have a lot of the same fixed costs with the kitchen, the bath, the permits, the site work, all looks kind of the same no matter how big you're building. So if we're building a, let's say a 750 square foot, 2-bedroom, 1-bath unit, you're looking at an all-in cost of the mid 300,000s or so. And that's for everything: site work, the building itself, appliances, permits. And if you're getting up to that 1,200 square foot limit we talked about, you're probably in the mid 400,000s.
So I'd like to know a little bit about how you started the company. So talk about how, I mean, you gave me a little bit about the background and sort of why this was interesting to you, but let's dig in a little bit about actually how you started the company.
Sure. So I was working in a coffee shop and was still working on the flips on the East Coast, trying to figure out how we're going to unload these in the in the winter of 2020. And I heard someone talking about ADUs, and at first was too nervous to get over and introduce myself, even though I was interested in learning more. So half hour later, though, these folks who had left that I'd heard talking came back by. So figured that was my sign. I needed to make myself go introduce myself and my interest in ADUs. And one of those folks introduced me to my business partner, Mike Moore, the contractor I mentioned to you earlier. So he and I met on March 14th as the country was shutting down. The Starbucks we were meeting in was like getting cleaned out and locked up, literally. So good thing we took that coffee. So he was doing about $1.5 million of revenue, maybe 6 projects a year, and doing new homes, doing renovations, had done 4 or 5 ADUs, and was looking to get into that space more. And that was why his friend had mentioned his name. He's like, you should talk to Mike. He's trying to do ADUs. And Mike understands construction, grew up in it. His family business was construction, so he knows all that piece of it. And from the other side of it, I was, I have a background in operations management, and I know what good looks like at a bigger scale than Mike did. So very quickly, we started talking about how to pilot this. And so out of that meeting, we were already figuring out how we were going to take his existing systems and start building on them. And what was great is that I wasn't necessary to his business. I mean, it was already running, with his 5 employees or so, and they were self-sustaining. So I was able to come in as a consultant, really, and just be additive to what they were doing. So some of the first things that I did was to build a basic website to generate leads in the ADU space specifically. And as he and I were learning more about the regulations and all the nuances, we were just putting everything we could on our website. So by the end of that year, we already had a lot of web traffic. We were generating easily half of our leads just from the website. So we started putting more and more there, started putting our pricing there as we started to offer these set plans. And that really snowballed and was what led to us growing so quickly in that space.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know this is kind of like your background is kind of building systems and scaling. It's just sort of a big question, but like, well, how do you scale a business? I mean, I have a lot of people come on the podcast and talk about sort of how they built their business, but it's really rare to have somebody who is kind of, well, not kind of, you are an expert in this. So can you talk about that in a little more general sense? Like whatever the business is that you're getting into, what are kind of like the essential building blocks that all businesses have to go through to start that flywheel turning so that you can scale?
Totally. And I was just talking about the sales and lead gen side. In parallel with that, we were setting up our project management system to manage the live jobs and the leads that were coming in. So Mike was operating in a email and a phone sort of setup, some Excel sheets, probably what a lot of small businesses look like without any sort of a project management system and software in place. So the first thing I was doing alongside building that website was setting up Builder, which is a project management software in residential construction. So immediately was interviewing him and his team about what their processes were like and translating those into the digital world. So setting up the schedules, the Gantt charts, templating out all the different purchase orders that would be in place for the different trades to build an ADU. What was the sequence? What were all the things they were doing on each job behind the scenes? What did that look like? So we started building out that straw man of what that would look like. Again, not essential to the operation. That was why this worked, because if I had been trying to do this on the side, there's no way it could have happened in addition to like operational duties. So as we were building that system out, as soon as we had like kind of a V1, a version that was workable, we started putting new jobs through that system. So over time, over a few months, we slowly got all of our new jobs into that project management software. And at first, everybody was resistant. Everyone is always resistant to change in tech. It's harder in the beginning. It feels like you're using a rocket launcher for a paper airplane. It's like, I could just throw it. Why am I doing this, right? So in the beginning, you have to face a lot of that and start quickly trying to show the benefit, find a small piece of it that you can point to that makes their life easier is often a way to do that. So by the time we had 10 jobs in there, now it's becoming evident to everyone, wow, if we didn't have this, there's no way we could manage this many jobs. We're like way beyond what we were doing before. So back to your question of like, what does it really look like? It's about getting into a framework where everybody has the same language for it. You have a house for everything. Everything has a home for documents and for processes. Everyone knows where to go and capture that information. And beyond just whatever your deliverable is, right? We happen to build little houses. If you have a product-based business or a service-based business, you're going to need one way to serve those clients. You're going to need another way to make sure that you are scaling your organization. And that looks different than your project management. So we use Asana for our task management of just our company improvement efforts. So getting that spun up pretty early as well. We probably did that in year 2. Gives everyone a collective consciousness of where to put ideas about your company. And it doesn't have to just be you anymore pushing that improvement. Now everyone can participate in the dialogue. You can hand off things to your own team or to subcontractors that are helping with a certain area of your business. So getting that framework in place where everybody has somewhere to collaborate, you have to have that before you can really start making and moving the needle in where your business is going.
And are you guys running any kind of system like EOS or traction or things like that? I mean, how do you get a for all of the stuff that you're working on together?
It's a lot of discipline to just force the weekly meeting on XYZ topic, that sort of thing. We've gotten better in the last year because I actually brought on a former colleague from Bain & Company that I'd worked with there. So she's now serving as our chief of staff to make sure that those development meetings happen, that we're moving initiatives forward and that sort of thing. So how do we do it? We have a regular cadence for check-ins with each of our different departments. And then as far as moving projects forward, we just schedule the meetings and make them happen. It's one of those things that's always easy to let the development type activities go. It's always easier to just focus on the operation and the fires, right? But we have to carve out the time to improve.
I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the top of the funnel in the beginning, where you talked about building the website and then sort of making it almost like an education platform about ADUs. But just talk a little bit more about lead generation, if you would.
Sure. So for us, it was about specializing in one area of ADU so that we could become the go-to resource. And if you're starting out and you pick too broad of a topic, you can't develop enough expertise quickly enough to really prove that online. So what we were able to do was find that there just wasn't as much out there about certain aspects of ADUs. Us being a general contractor is a huge differentiator. So almost all the other larger companies in the space or the venture capital financed companies in this space focus just on the feasibility and design portion. They have really beautiful websites, it's really splashy, but they don't build these things, which means they have to partner with contractors. So there is not a lot online about the actual build out and the actual pitfalls and permitting and those sorts of things. So we started publishing on areas that were easy to dominate. And from there, as you start building that out, all that is supporting the underlying search terms that your website is going to rank for. So we always want to be found when someone's looking for ADU builder. If somebody's looking for what is an ADU, they're not as far in their buying process as somebody who's already thinking about the building part. So we care most about those kinds of leads. We do also get the what is an ADU and like basic stuff as well, but it's really the more targeted searches that we're most interested in. So the other thing about just becoming like a leader in the space, you have to continuously add content to the website. So kind of like you were asking about how do we make sure that we're always moving our company forward, it's also how do you always create good content for website stuff. And we've had to rely on our team for that. So now everyone's in the habit of me asking like, could we write a blog about that, right? So now folks will come to me with ideas, maybe they even send me content, hey, this would be great for the website. And we're able to integrate that as we go. We also have a great product in a way that's exciting for people to see. People like to see homes being built. It's an HGTV-esque thing where they want to see a video of a new little house. So every single time that we finish a project, and we do about 40 a year, we'll do a full photo shoot with videos and walkthrough so that we always have new content for our YouTube channel as well, that we can hit our mailing list with, that we can hit our social media feeds with. So having those kinds of things that are part of the regular flow of our building process helps ensure that we remain high on the list every time someone's Googling ADU builder.
I mean, do you have is also that sort of systematized so that you're making sure you're capturing all of that on every job that you do? Is that sort of part of your process?
It is,
Yeah.
yes. It's one of our to-dos, just like our construction items are, to schedule that interview with the homeowner, schedule the video. Yes.
It's funny, you keep on anticipating my questions and your answers. But you know, now I forget the question that I was going to ask you, but so you're talking about sort of lead generation and sort of website and blogging. I was wondering, so you said you do YouTube as well. Like, what are the other channels in addition to just your website that you're using for lead gen?
Primarily, the other channels support what we're doing with our website.
Mm.
So by now, about 65% of our leads are organic search. Then the balance of that is referrals and our job site signs that we put up on every single job that we're doing. And we also have 3 trucks that are all branded. So as far as other platforms, we are on YouTube. That's where all of our project videos and client interviews go. We are also on Instagram and Facebook, and we're on Houzz and Yelp. So we have links to all of those, but those are not primary generators of traffic for us. We don't put a lot of independent time into making what we do on those platforms special. It's more like if you're looking for us, you need to find us, but we are not like leading content creators on those platforms. It's really supporting what we're doing with the website.
And you're not outsourcing this content either. You're sort of doing all this in-house as well.
We outsource like the mechanics of the posting and doing all that piece of it. But as far as like content ideas and like new photos, that is from our own team. And then we're just putting it into Asana to be picked up by the subcontractor.
Got you. I mean, I think it's also, you mentioned something a moment ago, which you mentioned in passing, but I think it's worth emphasizing because it's really, really important. When you were talking about the content of what you have on your website is not like what's an ADU, because the person who wants to know what an ADU is not far enough along in the process to be meaningful to you. You want to target what you're writing to the person who has already decided they want an ADU and they're looking for right now to buy, right? Or to get the process started. Can you talk a little bit more about how you sort of drill down and focus your content on that piece of the buyer journey? And even maybe how you identify the buyer journey for people who are thinking about how you do this.
Sure. And I don't think at the beginning, Jonathan, we were intentionally doing that. This is where we had the expertise. And as we've learned more about SEO and what works well, I think then we've kind of in retrospect realized, oh, wow, this is all about like buyer intention and these leads are better. So, it wasn't intentional at first. And I think now the way that we do it is just making sure to publish on topics that are actually coming up in the field. And so much of that is filling these content gaps that I was talking about. And then as far as though, like where to focus additional efforts, I mean, some strategies are to go and see what the competitors are putting out there and kind of do your own equivalent article, that sort of thing. But especially now in the era of Chat GPT and everything, if you're at too general of a level, all the articles look the same. I can't prove it, but it feels like people have lifted some of these more generic articles that we started off with as well. So when you go very specific, it's also much harder for others to replicate that. If you're putting in your own case examples, your own specifics about the homeowner situations, it's much harder for that content to just be lifted than if it were a very general top 10 reasons to build an ADU sort of article. So niching like down on the content has lots of benefits too.
And do you find a lot of your customers come in and they'll start telling you like, oh, I read this article that you wrote on your website, and they start asking you questions that are sort of very specific, pointed questions about your content?
100%. And we don't intentionally leave out detail of our blogs, but a lot of them, there's more nuance in every situation that you would need to get into. So folks will have read it, it's still the best resource out there on the website, but there's still not quite enough to go do it on your own. Again, not because we're trying to like lead them, but just because it's so detailed, you couldn't even put it all there. So we'll have people come to us saying, hey, you look like the experts in building an ADU by a pool. Like, can you come look at my property? Or, some other specific site work sort of situation. So we do end up getting a lot of those leads. We also have a lot of content on what it's like to build with an HOA. We get a lot of those leads as well. And we also have city specific landing pages that go into all the nuance of the regulation. But again, not just a distillation of the regulation that anyone could do. It's how did we actually see this city interpret that ADU law in practice? So then again, our content is more specific and original, and we get more leads off of that too.
And have you, Have you had any particular bottlenecks along the way that got in the way of you growing? And if so, how did you deal with those bottlenecks?
Oh, I think I am probably our biggest bottleneck when it comes down to it. And that, that's the case with a lot of small businesses, getting out of your own way and making sure that you take the efforts to make it into a process that you can hand off. And much like I was saying with like resistance to change with the team, when you feel that in yourself, right? You're like, oh, I can just do this. It's easier. I'll just do it myself. And every one of those little things snowballs to where suddenly you have all these little tasks on your plate. So being ruthless about, the third, fourth time you've done something, start forcing yourself to lay out that process, whether it's just in a quick Loom video that you can hand off to an assistant, something like that. I would also say that hiring folks around you is another forcing function for getting out of your own way and not being the bottleneck. That was part of the reason that I hired the former colleague from Bain, is that I knew that I was in the way of a lot of these HR processes, development type things, where I needed to hand it off to somebody. I needed the forcing function to keep her busy and give her things to engage in so that it would come off of my plate. So you might have to do that, invest ahead of it so that you have someone that's forcing you to not be the bottleneck.
I mean, you're kind of like speaking to me a lot right now, because I've just kind of reached this point myself where I realize like I'm actually the bottleneck in my own business and I need to start delegating stuff more. And at first I was like, what do I delegate? And in the past, I even had assistants and I could never think of what to delegate to them.
Right.
What I discovered was it really having the right assistant really matters, right? Or the right people on your team, because then you feel confident in delegating to them. And then suddenly you start delegating all kinds of stuff and you kind of get into this rhythm where you start naturally thinking of like, oh, I don't have to do this myself. I've got somebody to do that for me. I want to give it to them. And you quickly fill up their plate with things to do, right? And you start generating some traction once you're not trying to do everything, including stuff that you don't really want to do, right? So it's really important to just get help.
Totally.
So we've got a couple minutes left. I'm wondering, so where do you see this going? Where do you want to take this business in the next 5 years?
We're working on becoming a true dominant force here in San Diego. Right now, we are between 2 and 3% of the volume of detached ADUs being built. We think we can be more like 15 or 20% just in this market. So we're working to really hone everything we're doing locally. Subcontracting out labor is a very regional, local market. So if we were to jump to somewhere like LA or San Francisco or anywhere else across the country that's looking at ADUs, we would have to redevelop that entire subcontractor base, and also all of the regulatory content and hyper local pages that we just talked about on the website would have to be developed there too. So it's doable. It's what we're intending to do is something scalable, but we don't want to expand our geographic footprint too soon. So those are the trade-offs that we've made, where we do want to continue to stand out from, again, some of the VC money that loves to go into a lot of geographies at once. So we're staying hyper local while we build our processes.
And what are the problems you're going to have to solve in order to get to that, sort of 15 to 20% piece of the market share in San Diego?
Problems we're going to have to solve. I mean, really, the pricing is huge, and just financing. We were just looking at our CRM, and we had something like 1,100 leads in our system just from the last 12 months who just didn't have financing. Otherwise, we're a very viable opportunity. So figuring out how to continue to bring the cost down is part of it. We do belong to the Casita Coalition, that is an industry group in our state that advocates for reform. And some of those are targeted at lowering the overhead related to building these. So the state rules had a lot of great ideas about the building itself, but there wasn't a lot of nuance behind what happens with the utilities, what are the requirements for the grid, and all those sorts of things. So all those little add-ons can be tens of thousands of dollars in extras for improving the infrastructure with electric and water and gas. And yes, those are needed. But having all of that burden go onto one little project for a 500 square foot ADU just makes it totally unviable. So even working with the utility companies and figuring out, all right, what does an electrical upgrade look like? Does it have to take 6 months? Can we do it in 2? Like all those kinds of tangential things all impact the cost. So I think in the next few years, if we can bring the cost down by even 10%, we'd have a lot more people being able to build these.
And if there's any particular thing you would like people to know about ADUs or this business, or about your business in particular? Sort of, what is that? What do they really need? What message would you like to get out to people about this?
Message I'd like to get out is that ADUs are a flexible, low impact way to add housing, and they can really pivot to the needs of the family at the time. And I love that we have folks who build them knowing that, yes, we're going to rent it out for 10 years and then we're going to downsize into this ADU and rent our main home. So they offer a very versatile solution for a lot of different family problems.
I mean, actually, I was going to sort of end here, but that raises another interesting question. So it's kind of like the ADU in a way can also be like a way of aging in place, right? I mean, you can downsize on your own property and not move, not leave your social networks behind, stay near your family if they're still there, but just downsize without having to sell your house and move.
Exactly. And you might love your neighborhood. You might, love everything about it, but it's just, you don't need a 3,000 square foot house. So we see lots of folks doing that, designing this intentional smaller space to be their new home. And it's great because they're getting to make it exactly what they want. Maybe their family is going to take over the main house, or maybe they're going to rent it. We see all sorts of configurations. And there are also smart ways to split off part of the property. We see like nice privacy fences or uses of landscaping to kind of provide that barrier between the two structures, so they really do feel separate.
So if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about this, if they're in Southern California and they want to build an ADU, what is the best way for them to get in touch with you?
They can find all of our information on snapadu.com.
Awesome. Well, Whitney, I really appreciate you being on the show today. This is a really interesting discussion about a topic that I knew nothing about. So thank you for educating me, and it was great meeting you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Jonathan.